back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. It's mid-May, the weather is warming up, and that always has us thinking about getting outside more, training, and trips that we might have planned for the summer or fall. We've tried over the last several years to really look at topics around this fact, and we've talked with some great experts. We had Mike Prevost on, who's the guy that developed the ruck training program for many special forces. We've talked to Uphill Athlete. We've had our friends from Atomic Athlete as well as Summit Strength come on as guests and share their knowledge. And so we've tried to continue that same trend as we go into the spring of 2024. This year we sat down with Dr. Brent Ruby. Dr. Ruby is a professor at the University of Montana, and he serves as the director of the Montana Center for Work Physiology and Exercise Metabolism. He is the smartest guy in the room when it comes to studying one of America's most rugged jobs, wildland firefighting. He joins me for two parts. In the first part, which is the episode you're listening to now, we cover a variety of topics about nutrition, how it has an effect and an impact on the folks who hike miles in the mountains in the summer with heavy packs. Hopefully you're starting to see the correlation if you're not a wildland firefighter. In the second episode, we talk about ruck training or hiking with a heavy pack, how it can be effective, and how simple a plan can be. That's not all, though. We're also launching an article on the website to identify the 3 biggest things that change when we throw a pack on and hike in the summer months and solutions to fix them from a nutrition standpoint. It wasn't written by me, though. This was written by Heidi Brackebush. Heidi is brand new to the Valley to Peak team and a dietitian who did her study on nutrition and wildland firefighting. She does a great job in the article taking her skill set and applying it to those of us who aren't wildland firefighters but enjoy similar type of tasks in the summer. In fact, she didn't just study it, she was a wildland firefighter for many summers prior to finishing college. She now serves as a packer for the Forest Service in the Clearwater District through the summer months and has an impressive collection of photos from her days hunting here in Idaho with her husband and her family. To say we're excited to have her would be an understatement of the century. So lots of great things coming in May that we're excited about. We're excited to have you be a part of. Anything referenced in the show, including the link to this article, will be in the show notes. You can simply scroll down to whatever platform you're listening on, look at the show notes, click the link that's of interest to you, and you'll be squared away as far as getting access to those things. Without further ado, here is Dr. Brent Ruby in part 1 as we explore how to manage extreme demands in hostile mountainous environments.
It's become kind of my central mission, aside from just the research, to try to, anytime I have the opportunity to build on that sort of layperson platform, or to try to get the message across, even if it's just, it ends up being one clinician that's listening, and then 5 years down the road, wildland firefighters in the ER with this issue or that issue, and they realize, oh my gosh, this is the kind of person I'm dealing with. And it's also there or the other part that I'm really passionate about is clearing up misconceptions that folks tend to superimpose onto this workforce without even knowing what color shirts they wear. And that pisses me off beyond belief when people think, oh, I know exactly how these people should be fed or how they should be trained. And the first question I would have was, well, do you know what they eat and how much they eat and what the workloads are for the job? No, but I've seen video and I've seen it on the news. I'm like, that's not the same thing. So that's that, just to hold strong to that evidence-based approach. And I tell the fire crews over and over that we have to get the data into the literature, because that's the only way it's going to be viable and defensible. If somebody dies on the line and they look at the literature and there's something in the literature that can give them some hints, that's the only evidence-based data out there.
So I think it's a great spot to start in what initially got you so interested in this subset? And feel free to, in answering that, sort of introduce like who you are and what you do for work and kind of how that evolved over time. But I mean, that's one thing that stood out to me because, like I said, for folks to get a little bit of background into this, I regularly read Asker's blogs, right? And so Asker Juden Group is a nutrition researcher who is like anybody who is a dietitian or a nutrition researcher or anything involved in the performance nutrition world has heard of him and his work. And so I get on his website and see
Yeah.
this article highlighting wildland firefighters. And immediately I'm like, oh, that he never covers that. That's my group. Right. And, outdoor athletes and tactical athletes, etc. And so that's how I stumbled on your name. And then, this day and age, you naturally get on social media or start Googling a person's name and you get as much information. I think that the correct term here is creeping. I started creeping you and I was like, man, he's got this whole, like you were studying this stuff before it was cool. So I would, yeah, just love for you to have the opportunity, because I'm sure I will mess it up, for you to introduce yourself and sort of explain your background and how you got so interested in this group.
Yeah, that's such a loaded question because I mean, the short answer is it all happened accidentally in some way. I think it goes back to when I was a graduate student at New Mexico. I went to a Southwest American College of Sports Medicine meeting. This is like in, I don't know, 1990, something like that. And I was doing a presentation. It was the very first one I'd ever done. So I was nervous as all crap. And it was on some altitude study that we had done at New Mexico. We had an altitude chamber there. So go to the meeting. One of the presenters that was there was this researcher from the University of Montana. His name is Brian Sharkey. And he presented this really simple but elegant talk on the sort of some of his work from the 60s and 70s on some really basic metabolic demands of wildland firefighting. And he's the one that ultimately developed the pack test. He's the one that initially in the 60s got them to consider some fitness standard for them to consider, and that was the step test. And then the mile and a half run came into vogue, and then people figured out ways to cheat everything, and then they developed the pack test. Well, that's the first time I ever met Brian. And I'm like, that's kind of cool. Like that's a whole different world. Like I'm just living the lab. It's kind of cool. But I didn't really give it a second thought. And then when I was finishing at New Mexico, I was had no clue where I was going to end up. I thought, well, I guess we go wherever I get a job. And I got an interview at Montana, and then I got the job offer at Montana. And the reason why I accepted it is because A, I didn't have any other interviews lined up, and I didn't have any other job offers lined up. So I came to Montana. And when I got to Montana, of course, I re-met Brian. And I had met him a couple of times in other meetings past. And I just thought, what a gracious dude and a really nice guy. And from the get-go, he was such a uh, patient, at least on the surface. Maybe underneath he wasn't patient as a mentor, but he wouldn't push. He wasn't pressing like, you have to do this, like don't let this ball drop. It was more just he would come into my office and he'd drop these little seeds of wisdom and thoughts. And I'm like, yeah, how could I do that? How could I do that? Well, we are getting ready to go to the American College of Sports Medicine national meeting. I can't remember where it was. It was like in Ohio or somewhere, Cincinnati or something like that. And Brian had the brilliant idea of convincing me we should take the train. So we took the train from Whitefish all the way to the middle part of the country, which took like 30 hours or something like that. But at the meeting, there was, of course, there's no internet at this point yet, or if it was, is very much in its infancy. This is like 95, something like that. And on the way back on the way back, we had both picked up this flyer at the conference that the Army had this uh, research mechanism for new investigators, which is like essentially a nice way of saying we have money for people that don't know what they're doing and are brand new out of their terminal degree, but want to do research with us. I'm like, that's me. So I applied. It was the Defense Women's Health Research Program, and I applied for a project. And what I had hoped to do was to do some pretty intensive lab-based work with these tracers to measure glucose metabolism across males and females. But then I also wanted to measure energy expenditure in an unscripted, unpredictable wildland fire environment after talking with Brian for so long about it. And the reviewer comments came back and they were just scathing, like, yeah, this isn't going to work. This is pie in the sky kind of crap. I don't think that this is a viable study, but hey, it's new investigator money. So if it works, it works. And it worked. So, but from the very beginning, I started sort of spending a lot of time with one of the local crews, which was at the Lolo Hotshots, who are in Missoula here. And I spent time with their crew boss and some of their folks and just chatted up what I was thinking. But more than that, I just listened to what problems they perceived they had. And then I thought, how could I script this story? How could I script this plan to collect data on them around their perceived needs? And the basic first fundamental question was, well, how hard is the job? Like, we need to get in there and we need to measure the energy demands of the job. And using the technique that we used with the doubly labeled water approach, it's a gold standard way to measure this in free range humans. The problem is most of the time when it's applied in a clinical setting, or it's applied in a lab at first, or it's applied at or with some situation that you have control over, or you know when it's going to start. And the difference with this is we had no idea when these things were going to start. So as soon as the fire would, the crew would get deployed, we would get a call from the crew and we would deploy right alongside with them and then try to fit the technique in and around their working environment, which was an enormous challenge.
And that was one of the things that stood out to me, right? So I go to and I read this synopsis in this article that you wrote for Asker's website. And what stood out to me is that there is a difference and I think that you know this and appreciate this. There is a dramatic difference between theory and being in a lab and then going out there. And I think there's even, like, you sort of even took it to another level in the sense of, you know, we're not talking about a group of 15 basketball players on the University of Montana's basketball team where you have them come over after class. We're talking about a pretty rugged environment that you went into, right? And so I think that it's important that you highlighted all of that, because all of that research, and you feel free to correct me if I've got this wrong, this timeline wrong, all of the years of your research with that led to this. Basically, I'm going to call it in a I'm not doing it justice by calling it this comprehensive study on a group of people that we have no idea about up to that point. And so I'm even going to take it another step and say it's probably the gold standard in measuring the nutrition needs of outdoor athletes, tactical athletes, wildland firefighters, which are extreme of extreme of extreme of extreme. So it led to this article that I printed out that you wrote, and it's not really an article. It's almost like, so in nutrition, like you had mentioned it earlier, but the National Society for Nutrition will come out with these summaries. It's basically this large synopsis that says, look, we researched everything available on this topic, and here's what we recommend. And it's got it for a variety of different sports, and you basically created it for this one of wildland firefighting. But it's important that you laid the foundation for that, because, and you corrected me in some notes that we had prior to this podcast by saying, look, I put that together because of 20 years or more of this research.
Yeah.
Can you, and I'm sure this is, I'm going to ask you some specifics about the research, and I'm sure what I'm about to ask you to do is going to be really challenging because this is your baby, and it's deep. But can you, for the listener, and I'll preface this by saying to the listener, you may not be a wildland firefighter, but you probably are, if you're listening to this, doing some pretty rugged stuff outside, training a lot, something like that. So there is some direct application and crossover here. But can you give a 30-foot overview of that study, and not necessarily the findings of it so much as what was it about? What were you trying to accomplish in writing it?
Are you talking about the comprehensive review article?
Yeah, the physiology of wildland firefighter,
Okay.
which is managing extreme energy demands in hostile, smoky, mountainous environments. And I'll link this in the podcast notes.
Oh,
So for
good.
anyone who is interested, they've got a direct link that they can go to and look at. And I would highly suggest they go do it. I mean, I maybe it's just the nerd in me, but I loved it.
It was probably one of the hardest articles I've ever written, but it was definitely one of the most fun articles to put together. About 12 years ago, I got approached by one of the editors for that journal, and he said, "Gosh, I'd love to get you to write a comprehensive review of wildland fire." And I said, "I'm not ready yet." He goes, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "I don't have enough data yet." And he goes, "Dude, you've been doing this for like 15 years." And I go, "I know, and I don't have enough data yet, and no one else is doing it. So I need a little bit more time." So it did take me about 25 years to get to a point where I was like, okay, time to sit down and write this thing. Because we had to do, so the article that you're talking about is a comprehensive review of all the research that's been done or related to the world of the wildland firefighter. Not all of the data has been collected by us, but the vast majority of on the scene, on actual assignments, that is mostly us. The rest of it is some smoke stuff and some stuff on simulated or prescribed burns from some folks in Australia who do awesome work. But yeah, it took a really damn long time to
So,
do that.
and out of that writing came very specific numbers. What are the calorie needs for someone
Mm,
who's doing this type of work? What type of electrolyte replacement, and we'll get to this,
mm,
is needed, if any? What happens
yeah,
if you supply everything someone needs and left to their own devices, right? So it's not like it's just this general overview. It is comprehensive guidelines for people
yeah,
like me to then use in a clinical setting or in a
yep,
consulting setting or whatever, where you're not just kind of like winging it for folks who are doing this type of work. You are giving them exact metrics based on data. And
yep,
here's the other thing I loved about the study: 25 years, which tells me right off the bat, like as I start to dive into the introduction, I can trust this. This wasn't a 5 week, you had a
no,
few interns in over the summer type of a deal. This is 25 years of solid evidence from folks who know what they're doing, aggregated to basically put out a general synopsis. And this is what I think, like, as just as a side note, I think it's important though, even for the folks that are listening. This is sort of the problem in today's age, because you will have a blogger read one study involved with 5 people over 2 weeks, and they've got some sort of results from that study that favor their hypothesis, and they
yep,
broadcast it as though it's the same type of summary you did. Oh, here's the fix, here's the solution. And so you have folks who maybe don't understand science take that, run with it, try to apply it, and then they're just so confused why it didn't work. And it's like, well, it's so limited that it's not even like it's kind of wasted your time even reading it, to be honest. And so
yeah,
that was what I'm just sort of like a fanboy, even though I've only known about you for 2 weeks. I love the work. It embodies everything that I feel like I can trust in as a consultant who works with people. Is that, look, this is really good data, and I have good reason to believe that these recommendations are going to apply to you. So I read through this, and as hard as it was, came up with really 5 questions that I think will be helpful for everyone to really kind of condense this down into understanding it. And you've graciously agreed us to join us for a second episode, and we'll kind of talk about what that's going to look like later. So the first one is this: from a high level, can you give us an idea of how adverse environments affect our ability to do 3 things: perform well, adapt to that hard work, and recover? And you could, tackle those all separately or the same. Specifically, I'm curious about heat, snow, or, some sort of a terrain difference, temperature, altitude, low water intake, just environments that, we're not normally exposing ourselves to, but we are now exposing ourselves to an adverse environment and working harder than we probably are on your average day.
Yeah, that's a great series of loaded questions. Well, we know, so we stitched this comprehensive review together with hundreds of original investigations, which are the foundation for being able to write a review paper. It's not like we're just taking notes out of our lab book and then writing this review paper. These are from other published papers that focused on the energy demands, on the electrolyte needs, on heat stress, on the metabolic demands of the job, on what the season does to a person, all these different topics. But the human is enormously resilient when you stick them in a different environment. The physiology abides. And it's absolutely incredible when you take a person and you put them in the heat and you watch how they adapt. It's predictable. And you can build predictive algorithms to forecast when somebody's going to be ready for what environment, especially heat. Cold is a little bit different. But in the wildland firefighter, heat is a massive enemy. And so sort of the first foundational block that we established was to figure out the energy demands. Once we had that big foundation set, now we can start building these other complex questions. Oh, well, how do we feed them? Oh, what's the sweat rate? What supplements do they need? Or what supplemental feeding strategy do they need? How do we train them better? All those have to be fleshed out after we know what the energy demands are. And the energy demands of the job, we've done this in 2 different big studies, one in the 90s and one in about 2012. And the total energy demands are about 4,000 to about 6,500 calories a day. And you think about, well, okay, sometimes they're on an assignment for 3 days. Sometimes they're on an assignment for 7. Their whole role could be 14 days. So there are some windows of time when they're really having a difficult time getting enough to eat because the energy demands are so high. And there are other times when it's not so high. And so they adjust especially hotshot crews. Most of the crews that we've studied and that we followed over the years are hotshot crews. And they're they're so well trained. They're better calibrated than most of the instruments that we try to use to measure whatever it is we want to measure on them. But I know that might answer only one of those many questions.
So here's some specifics. Would 2 questions based kind of on what you're saying here. One, could we say that an extreme environment like being in a high heat situation, right? Like, so for hotshot crews, we're talking about literally being on a fire line. But for maybe for folks who are listening, this is an early August hunt, right? Where temperatures could be really hot, water's really unavailable up high. So it's not like you're getting much of that. Can we say that increases energy demand just based off of temperature, either hot or cold? And as an extension of that, can we say that if your net intake over a period of let's call it an expedition, or let's call it a hunt, or in the case of these folks, over the series of while you're on the line, if the net intake is equal to the expenditure of the need, will you still perform well? So in other words, you could be high on, you could have, your intake could be at 6,000 on the days that you're on the line, but on the days that you're at camp, it's 3,000, but the expenditure is lower. So as long as the net intake is equal to the expenditure, does performance stay the same?
More than likely. It's really difficult to measure performance in a group like this because what is performance? It's not like, oh, good, you're able to still do the same number of push-ups and pull-ups. That's not super specific to the job demand. But the environment, backing up to that first question, the environment, a lot of times there is this perception that, oh, if we put a person in the heat or we put a person in the cold, we put a person in an atypical environment, that their total energy expenditure is somehow going to be exaggerated because of that environment. That's not necessarily the case. And it's not the case with these crews. The energy expenditure is going to be about the same, but how you maintain homeostasis drives other physiological processes radically different. So in the heat, the muscle decides to use more carbohydrate than it might otherwise use in a cooler environment at the same absolute intensity. The sweat rate can change radically, which drives the demand for additional supplemental water and supplemental electrolytes. It drives that up. But one major misconception that has haunted the world of occupational physiology, and especially that of the wildland firefighter, is that when I do my job in the heat, all I need to do is get enough fluid and electrolyte, and all will be well with the world. And that is the biggest pile of horseshit that has been pushed onto these teams, is that if you drink enough, you will be protected. That is absolutely false, because we have done studies. Well, we haven't done them on purpose. We have a case study of a heat illness situation where the person was just drinking and drinking and drinking, trying to manage their own fluid intake, thinking that, well, I can maintain thermal regulation just by simply drinking enough. And they didn't, and they overheated, and they went down and collapsed from heat exhaustion, heat exhaustion. And so we've always tried to tell folks, fire crews, that you know how much to drink. The body can tell you that. It's fantastic. The kidneys are amazing. The thirst mechanism is amazing. And so when you follow that, and we have measured this in hundreds of crew members with different tracers, so we can quantify the 24-hour fluid demands. And regardless of the environment, the fluid demand is pretty darn consistent. It's about 6 to 10 liters per day for
So
24-hour window.
can you go back to that and talk about why is that? If fluid demands are met, electrolyte demands are met, yet a person is getting heat exhaustion, and I don't want to lead with the answer, but can you sort of explain why would that be? If a person's electrolyte needs are being met and their fluid needs are being met, why would and they're not taking any food, why would the heat exhaustion still hit them? And I think that, like, as you answer this, it's important to remember this has direct application to people training for ultras, direct
Yep.
application for
Yep.
people that are training in some of these long distance, high intensity, usually in the heat type of events.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. The simple answer is because the human body is not a crappy automobile with a subpar radiator. It doesn't work like that. You don't fill it up with water and the water circulates and keeps the engine cool. That's not what the body doesn't do that. If you fill it up with water, the extracellular water, the intracellular water, the plasma volume, that can be maintained. But that doesn't help you offload heat if the muscles are so metabolically active and producing monstrous amounts of heat, and you have a very difficult time dumping that heat to the environment, especially in a hot situation when you're next to the fire line or whatever, and you got all this crap on top of the skin. So it's really hard to leverage the benefits of evaporative cooling. And so you just continue to work, continue to produce heat, and continue to be compromised in your ability to offload the heat, which means you retain it. And then no matter what you do, you could run around with a scale and a graduated cylinder and measure fluid demands and hit it perfectly, and still heat exhaustion will hit you because you can't offload the heat fast enough.
So is the answer in that scenario they need to rest?
Slow down. Yeah, pace thyself.
I love that because
Yeah.
here is why I love that. There is a mantra pervading the endurance community, pervading the backcountry hunting community, pervading all of these different communities about just push yourself. You can survive days without food. You don't need any rest. You don't need to stop. Push yourself, drive hard, discipline equals freedom, choose your all of this stuff, right? And it's like, okay, that all sounds really great on a podcast and selling your t-shirts and selling your banners, but that is not how the human body functions. And the irony of this is I got an email just this week from someone who, during their Thanksgiving break, they'd went out on a hunt. They hadn't eaten all day. They were pushing through some brush. The next thing they know, they're in a hospital. So what had happened
Oh,
was he was with his hunting buddy. They had been hiking all day long. He hadn't stopped to eat. He hadn't stopped to drink. He was sweating, even though the ambient temperature was 30 degrees, and he was pushing
mm-hmm.
through a bunch of willows. He passed out, went into a seizure, and his buddy
Yep.
carried him back to the truck, called an ambulance, took him to the hospital. And so his question to me was, "What happened?" And I said, "You probably just didn't eat or drink anything. You needed to stop." And so
Yeah.
his reply to me was, "Well, I've always been under this assumption that I could go, days without eating. And if I just pushed hard on these hunts, then I should be fine." It's like, well, you won't die, but you won't, like, that. The point is not to go out and not die. The point is to go out and have a great time. So I love that you pointed that out. And like, it's one thing for me to say this. It's another for a researcher who's worked with some of these guys, because wildland firefighters aren't uh, they are not soft guys, right? Like, these are some of the most, and women. I mean, these are some of the most rugged individuals taking on some of the hardest tasks. And so it's not like there's a weak mind involved with these folks.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best thing to do is just slow down.
Yeah. The that's hard to teach a young male or a young active person to do, because they just think they can push, push, push. And what the first thing that we try to tell folks, especially when they enter an environment that they're not acclimatized to, which is usually a hot, humid environment. If you're coming from the Northern Rockies and you need to go to Hawaii to race Ironman, you're not used to that environment. And so the only thing you can do is slow down. You have to. It's painful to look at your GPS watch and realize, wait a minute, I normally run a 6:30 pace. Why do I feel like crap and it's a 7:30 pace? Because you're not acclimatized to that environment. Now, the humans can acclimatize wonderfully, and but it takes a while. And so we're trying to do studies now that are all lab based to look at short-term heat acclimation and how fast it happens, if it varies between males and females, and how do we vary the intensity of work to make that more successful. But
So would that be similar to like having someone run a sauna protocol before trying to acclimate to a higher altitude, or trying to simulate the environment you're going to through something like that?
yes, that if a lot of the in terms of heat acclimation, that's the sort of the classic model. So if you spend a lot of time in that environment before you're ready to turn on the burners and race or compete or train or whatever, you have to change. What changes is blood distribution changes, sweat rate changes,
Yeah.
sweat composition changes. All those things changes. All those things that change favor your ability to offload heat, and then you can gradually upregulate the intensity, and also gradually upregulate how much you can tolerate consuming during a race like Ironman or something like that. The last time I did Ironman in Kona was 2010, and I spent 2 weeks in our heat chamber. Each morning I'd wake up and say, what's the temperature going to be in Kona? Okay, set the heat temperature to that, and I'd ride 50 miles in the chamber. I did that for 10 days prior to going over there. And when I got over there, the environment was exactly what I thought it was going to be, because I've been there many times, but I was completely acclimatized to the environment and felt awesome. And then 2 days before the race, I got a cold. So it was all for nothing. But I did a fine job of acclimatizing. So, but yeah, that's to expose yourself to the environment that you're going to need to do the work that you need to do in. Exposing yourself to that gradually and persistently will pay off massive dividend in the end.
So going back to the water, the electrolyte thing, while no one's eating, one of the other interesting points that I loved in there was that you highlighted daily carb consumption among these folks, if given the opportunity to have it, it's between 3 and 6 grams per kilo of body weight. And so if you do the math on that, that's a lot of carbohydrate when you talk about someone who is a male weighing 180, 200, 225 pounds or whatever. Yet the interesting thing is that they were often given MREs, which are low in carbohydrate, or not that high in carbohydrate. So here's my main question: why do agencies seem to be so fixated on supplying? Because I see this in special forces guys too, in terms of the provisions they're given by the military. So fixated on high fat, moderate to high protein, because a part of your study was like they had no trouble hitting their protein targets, and that was at a
No problem.
1.8 gram per kilo, which is on the higher end of things. Why do these agencies seem so fixated on giving people high fat, moderate to high protein, relatively low carbohydrate foods when we have bodies and bodies and bodies and bodies and bodies and bodies of evidence that say you always perform better at higher intensities with a high carbohydrate diet?
Yeah, I don't know if the agencies are purposefully trying to provide high fat, high protein sources to make the nutrition that way. I think that is coming along for the ride. What they're pushing is the military ration provision approach. It's convenient, it's low logistics, and it gets sustenance to the masses in those trenches. But what comes along for that is it is going to be high in fat. It is going to be high in protein as a function of the design of those processed foods. I don't think they're consciously trying to avoid carbohydrates. But I mean, we have the absolute worst measurement technique to try to do with these cruises to try to accurately record what they eat. That is such a pain. And we've really refined our techniques over the decades and gotten very, very good at doing that and dialing in exactly what they're getting. And most of the time, when left unencumbered, they do get enough carbohydrate, fat, and protein. The times when they fall short is when they are reliant on MREs. And probably
Yeah.
one of the most dangerous aspects of that is if it's a hardworking assignment, they're going to lose muscle glycogen regularly each shift. And each recovery window post shift prior to the next one, it's going to be almost impossible for them to put it back and to restore it. And so what you get is this gradual stair step sort of effect where they just decrease their glycogen. And somebody's trying to distract me in the window. But they gradually deplete their glycogen stores. And then it's 4 o'clock on the fourth day of that assignment, and they got nothing left. And now all of a sudden the fire behavior kicks up. And now all of a sudden they're trying to make decisions on where to order a slurry drop or a water drop from a helicopter or to move the crew from here to this safety zone. And it's like, I can't think straight. And so it becomes it's a whole different ball game as compared to, oh, I'm sorry, you didn't eat enough carbohydrate. You're not going to be able to run as fast or kick a ball as fast on the pitch. That's okay, you're not going to die, but if you make poor choices in the operational environment and it translates to making bad decisions, lives are on the line.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as I can't run as fast.
That's a it's a it's
So
a it's a great example because like what we often see, like one thing I'll say all the time is totals and timing. You need to hit a daily cap and you need to be taking
yeah,
in carbohydrate regularly when you're on these
yeah,
expeditions.
yep,
And they'll say, well, I'll come back at the end of the day and I've got this whole bag of food left. Is that okay? No, not because I care about that day. I care about 4 days from now, right? Like, and a
yeah,
really good example of this would be someone who's trying to climb Kilimanjaro or trying to summit Everest. You may have a window, and if you are behind and not feeling good because you haven't taken advantage of trying to hit those numbers for the day, your window is probably going to be gone. And like you're saying, it's not going to be a deal where it's like you happen to be last in group and you wanted to be first. You're not going up, and then you develop. Now all of a sudden you've got a second issue on your hands where you are now a risk. You're a liability to the group, not an asset. Because if you get on top and you haven't had enough and you can't think straight, someone's got to get
right,
you down, and
yep,
that's a very big problem when you talk about some of these bigger trips. It's a very big problem. I mean, the scenario I just gave where you're with a buddy in the backcountry. I mean, that guy had to pull that guy out to a
yep,
road to get to an ambulance. That's you know, I love my friends, but I would do that for them if I could, but I don't want to have to put
right.
myself in that position either. So I think that it's an excellent point to make. You had written in here like, well, I don't know if it was you or someone, but someone that was a part of this study. In the synopsis, you said between shift recovery of the muscle, bioenergetic stores can be compromised if adequate carbs aren't available. And so, in layman's terms, what that means is if when you're not on the line, you're not replenishing those glycogen stores, you're probably going to have compromised quote performance later on. Can you
Yep.
talk about the importance of why that's so important to replace those and what type of recommendations you would have for someone to replace those when they're resting from like a wildland group?
The highest intensity that we seem to find regularly on the line in the large muscle groups is when they hike into the fire line, they hike around on the fire line during the day, and they hike out. Those seem to be the highest metabolic intensities. But digging line is no short task, and moving brush and throwing brush and using a chainsaw and more hiking. And so, depending on the intensity, they need to regulate their intake. But the intake of regular carbohydrates, and it doesn't have to be much, it could be 25 to 45 grams an hour during different windows of work where the intensity is the highest. But if you don't do that, it puts more weight on making incredibly solid decisions on the back end to help restore what has been taken from the muscle. I always tell these crews and athletes the best way to ensure adequate recovery from the session that is going to require recovery from is to make good choices during that training session. Don't wait until the end when you're like, oh, sweet, I'll just kick back. I got my graduated cylinder. I've measured out a perfect amount of carbohydrate. I'm going to take it at 30-minute intervals. I'm going to put my Normatec massage pants on. I'm going to be perfect. It's like, no, make good decisions in the situation that's depleting your glycogen in the first place. You'll recover a lot faster. So just we try to convince them to consider their provisions for the work shift to be uh, far more in flux than just a sack lunch. Like, don't eat it all at once. Eat it regularly throughout the day. That'll facilitate a more a normalized blood glucose response to the day. You'll have regular exogenous fuels throughout the day for the muscle, and you'll set the muscle up for optimizing the recovery of that glycogen in the aftermath and what might be 8 hours or 12 hours before the next shift. So,
Yeah, that's great. I mean, often you'll hear people who come back from a tough training session and will say, like, I just didn't, I didn't do well, but I don't understand why, I ate some carbs. It's like, well, what was the dose? Because you've got to
Yeah,
remember both totals and timing. So you could be
yeah,
getting some in, but if it's not meeting the requirement, right? Like, so we've talked a ton on here before about that 30 gram, 60 gram, 90-gram dose based on how
hmm
much you're using in an hour, the intensity and all that stuff. But what you're saying is, and what it reminds me of, when you've got crews going in, working the line, coming out, that's a day hunt, right? And so for some guys, you get September elk, some ladies, September elk.
hmm
That's often what they're doing. They're jumping around from these little pockets that they know, doing 10, 11 miles, couple thousand vertical feet every day over 7 days. And so, to your point, yes, you can eat great at camp at night. That's
yeah,
great. But if you neglect the day, you will fall short. And that will
yep,
show up on day 2, day 3, when you've got to stay in camp
oh
the
yeah,
whole day because now you've got no gas left in the tank. And it's like, well, the complaint is usually, well, I just didn't want to stop. And it's like, well, now you got to stop.
yeah,
So it's just this interesting dichotomy. I want to go back to another thing that you had mentioned earlier when you were talking about the calorie needs ranging between 3 and 6,000. That's a huge gap. Can you give some ideas on what factors are involved between 3 and 6? Like what
yeah.
type of things would push a person more towards 6 as opposed to staying towards 3?
Well, it's important to note that those measures are absolute energy expenditures. They're not scaled to body size or anything like that. When you scale everything to body size, then like let's say you separate males from females. The males in an absolute metric like total kcals per 24, they'll generally have higher numbers because they're bigger, their body mass is higher, they have more muscle mass, and they're doing the same work, they're doing the same height, they're carrying essentially the same weight relative to body mass. So the absolute number is going to be higher. But when you scale it to body size, there's no difference in men and women. It's the same. So relative to body mass, there's no difference. So body mass drives some of that, body composition drives some of that. And then the terrain is the terrain and the work assignment and the nature of those assignments that stack together during whatever that measurement period is. Some of those studies were 3 days worth of work. Some of them were 7. And so when you're digging line in Salmon, outside of Salmon, Idaho, on the North Fork of the Salmon, I mean, it's like rocky steepness everywhere you go. And so it's hiking up steep, rocky terrain. It's digging line in that terrain. The altitude is a little bit higher, quite a bit higher than it is in, let's say, Lake City, Florida. And so the terrain is totally different. So just the nature of the job drives that. But that's why when we did those studies, we didn't want to just focus on just one assignment. And we also didn't want to blow all of our research money on one assignment, because every time we deploy one dose of that tracer to get one measure of energy expenditure in one subject, it's about $1,500.
Yeah, I was
So
gonna
you have
say
to be
that
very, very careful.
that was something that stood out to me is that you were using basically the gold standard to measure energy
Mm-hmm.
expenditure, right? You were doing doubly labeled water, which tells me those numbers sound high. And so if you were, let me rephrase, I'll come back and rephrase some of this. Those numbers sound high. So you hear 6,000 and you think, oh man, his calculation, the energy estimating equation had to be off. It's like, nope, that's not off. That's the gold standard. They were using that. And that is
Yeah.
how high some of that expenditure can be, because you often hear people say, like, well, I'm afraid to eat that much. It doesn't sound like that seems really like a really high estimate in terms of my expenditure for that training session or that day or whatever. It's like, that's not high. And this proves it. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a heavy energy expenditure. Going into something else that you had mentioned in the study was sodium, right? Which is the predominant electrolyte lost in sweat. You lose much sodium if you're not replacing it. It's very likely you're going to have to stop because of the deficits there. Can you talk a little bit about what you observed from a sodium loss standpoint in this group, what you observed if left to their own devices and consumption, and whether or not a replacement was needed. Was an electrolyte
Mm,
supplement needed?
yeah. Well, that question is, you would get a different answer to that question if you talk to a lab hydration specialist that focused on measuring serum sodium, sweat rate, sweat composition, nude body weight changes, and urine color. You're going to get a very different answer than when you ask me about what happened in the world of wildland. Because when you look at the job, you think, oh my gosh, the water turnover can be 10 liters in 24 hours. That is massive. It's not as high as we've measured. We measured it quite a bit higher in other scenarios in 24 hours, like other ultra marathons. But that's a lot of freaking water. And so you think, well, you don't want to get hyponatremia, so you obviously have to balance that with adequate electrolyte. So, and then your mind starts to make these links that shouldn't be there, but they're there because of persistent marketing from a lot of these products. And I'm not knocking any of these products. The only way I'm knocking these products is if they say they're needed without doing their homework to understand what the situation is. It's very different to say how much electrolyte you need to consume during Ironman or during a hot weather marathon or other ultra marathon, because that's not a job. You're only consuming what's available to you on this rolling buffet along the nasty lava fields of Kona. You're not consuming regular food during that. So you have to rely on those supplemental products. But we've measured the energy intake very precisely, and the sodium intake that these crews routinely get is well over 6,000 milligrams per 24 hours. That's what an athlete would consume during an Ironman.
So just to go back to what you were saying, you're in saying that, you're saying in an Ironman it's different. You need the supplementation because there you can't eat. You cannot eat
Yeah,
enough food with enough sodium to match the need.
right,
But these groups are different in the sense of this is a job and they are provided daily rations. And so,
right.
and I'm just going to say this, I love you because you highlighted this point. You're in saying, look, these supplement companies, if they want to say a situation like Kona where their food availability, actual food that you can sit down and chew, is limited, so it's justified. You might
That's
need,
why you need it.
some sort of a
Yeah,
supplement. But in this situation where you can eat plenty, you don't need to go spend X dollars on these quote high performance electrolyte replacement drinks.
mm,
I love that you pointed that out. Um, with that said, can you please tell us why we should stop freaking out about sodium in food that is on the mountain, in backpacking food or whatever? Because I just get, people will often be so concerned about the amount of salt, and it's like, okay, if you were a sedentary office working individual with zero activity in your life,
yeah,
maybe, but you're not. You're talking about an entire different set of circumstances.
yeah, yeah. And with the sweat rate, it's almost impossible to measure sweat rate on the fire line because you're not going to be able to chase them down. It's very difficult to get regular nude weights. Very difficult to get serial blood samples. It would be difficult to get sweat patches off of them and at the right time. So you can't. It's not a lab type of environment. But when they consume 6,000 or 6,500, or sorry, 6,500 milligrams of sodium each day, they're getting that through a combination of highly processed foods because a lot of those persist on the line. That's just how it is. And so you don't need to become overly concerned about, oh my gosh, I got to make sure and get my XYZ supplement that has all this extra sodium in it because that's what the company's telling me I need. If that's all you're consuming, then yeah, it's an appropriate use of that. But when you have to consider it in combination with all the other things that they dump into their system, and some of that intake that makes up that 6,500 is coming from some electrolyte drinks. Some of it's just coming from regular food. It's a balance all the way through. But to say they absolutely need more to maintain hydration is absolute crap. And we know that because it's not like we just measured what the sodium intake was. We took a blood sample before and after the shift, and serum sodium did not change. If serum sodium is depleted and it's low, then you know they didn't eat enough. But when it doesn't change and their body weight doesn't change that much, A, they had enough sodium, B, they probably had enough water, and they do a really darn good job. The smart people do.
I think that
Experience wise.
I think what you just said is a phenomenal synopsis to broadcast that message to any supplement, whey protein,
Yeah.
any of those things. It is a situation and a scenario based use where if you can't get it from food, it is a supplement. It's designed to
Yep.
fill in the gaps. But to say you absolutely need it would be complete and 100% marketing. And one of the things that I loved about your research and that you pulled this out, like you sort of read between the lines and pulled this out, when left to their own devices, or like the fancy word we use is ad libitum,
Yeah.
when left to their own devices, they eat and get everything they need when it's available to them, right? And
Yeah.
it's just it's an incredible testament to the human body being able to compensate what it needs. I love what you said earlier when you said that the physiology abides. One random question that I had as you were thinking about that validity of something like a sweat patch, which is a kit that you can order, you put it on, you go exercise, you submit it, and they tell you basically what your sweat rate is, and you can figure out sodium replacement. That's the theory anyway. Curiosity of your thoughts on that, and something like the Pandoff equation, which was developed by the military to estimate energy needs for someone hiking. And it takes into factors like terrain type, pack weight,
Mm.
that type of stuff. Any validity to those, or would you say instead, just listen to your body?
Oh man, yeah, that's like saying what's more accurate, heart rate or RPE? Because they're both measuring essentially the same density metric, but like having been a, a triathlete for many many years and racing and running my whole life, and it's so easy to get sucked into the next thing. And it could be, oh, this is the next best way to make sure you can change a flat fast enough. Oh, this is the next best saddle. Oh, these are the next best aero bars. Or a lot of it is bike heavy. And then a lot of it in Ironman is around nutrition. And the first Ironman I ever did was in 1988 in Canada. And the only thing we had available to us was this crappy electrolyte product that wasn't Gatorade. It was some Shackley electrolyte product, and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, grapes, bananas, and cookies. And we finished. And we didn't talk about it all the time. But
Yeah,
now it's
yeah.
like everybody wants to talk about what their post race nutrition is and what their this is and what I mean, they love talking about what they eat far more than actually eating it, because it's just not that desirable of a food source. But um, I just think you have to be really careful when you separate out life in the laboratory, which a sweat rate thing works wonderfully in that situation. It helps you understand how the body adapts to progressive heat stress. Because if you do a sweat patch, and we do that all the time, we put a sweat patch on, oh, cool, measure that, measure nude body weight before and after, measure rectal temperature the whole time, measure skin temperature at 7 different sites, um, spin that patch at the end of the trial and quantify the sodium content within that and look at the sweat composition. At the end of, let's say, 5 days, you do it again. And those practices teach you this, how incredible the adaptive capabilities are. But to take that information and say, I'm going to use this information, I'm going to tell you how much to drink out on the lava fields of Kona, that's where it starts to crumble big time. And you have to be really careful, because knowing a little bit about something, um, that's not it's precise in one environment, but it falls apart in the outside environment,
Yeah.
can be lead to some pretty faulty practices.
Yeah, but one thing that I'll often say in working with someone is you've got to remember, because everybody wants optimal, right? They want to know the standard, the metric. What should I be doing? It's like I'll
Train your
tell
ass
you.
off.
What was that?
Train your ass off.
Yeah, and I'll
Then
say, look,
everything else falls into place.
I'll say, look, I'll give you those. I'll give you those numbers, but you've got to remember there is a
Yeah.
difference between optimal and practical. So you have
Yeah.
to find a balance somewhere in there of knowing that data, but then also knowing, look, you've got two kids, you've got limited amounts of time to train,
Mm-hmm.
you've got all of these other factors that may lean you towards practical, and you've got to remember that's okay. You're not going to
Mm-hmm.
fail or be at any sort of a deficiency compared to somebody else who's with you, who's got the ability to do all these other things. And I think that this is so true in things like ultra training and in things like hunting and things like all these other things. There is a dramatic difference between, like we talked about this before we even press record, dramatic difference between someone's ability to have financial resources, between someone's ability to go out and practice, to be able to go dedicate time to train, to be able to go do all of these things when they don't have kids or a spouse,
Oh
and
yeah.
do have kids and
Yeah.
a spouse, right? Like that
Yeah.
that alone is a big difference. So two more things and then I'm gonna let you go. One, tell me about your book, Banjo and Rango.
Oh.
Is that it? Did I say it right?
Rango and Banjo. Yeah. Rango and Banjo on the fire line. Uh yeah. I I had wrestled with this idea, and I wrestle with ideas regularly, which drives my wife Jo crazy. But my biggest wrestle with a lot of the years and years with fire crews was, I just felt like, oh, it's really hard to take the scientific literature and translate it to them for them to understand it and then apply it. That's one thing. It's very important for a scientist to feel like they're making a difference in the world with their research. My problem was I wasn't satisfied with just that. It didn't feel like it was filling all the holes that I could possibly fill in trying to serve that community. And so, of course, I was wrestling with what's the problem, and it just pained me to visit with crews and have them say, I can deal with the diet, I can deal with the work, I can deal with the heat, I can deal with how hard the job is, I can train for that. I'm good with all that. The research has really helped me make those changes. And then they're like, but the one thing that's hard for me now is I have to leave my family. And when I was a new hotshot years ago, I didn't have that. I didn't have those responsibilities or the beauty of that. Now I have that, and that responsibility comes with a responsibility. And it was painful to hear stories about how hard it was for crew members to leave their families and then come back and assimilate. And I thought, I don't my research can't fill that hole. And so I thought, man, I feel so bad and I knew what it was like. I mean, I knew what it was like being away for long chunks of time trying to collect the data, with these crews being out for 2 weeks with little kids at the time. Now my kids are grown up and married and not little kids anymore. But it was really painful. And I thought, you know what? I want to try to figure out a way to address that for these families. And so that's why I wrote this children's book. So Rango and Banjo, well, Rango passed this last summer, but at the time they're two dogs that I have, two border collies. And they were just a joy to have them both together, but I love taking them up on the mountain and walk around. They live 99% of their life off a leash in the hills, running around. And I was hiking with them one day and thought, I really want to write a children's book about a unique fire crew that's a fire crew, a hotshot crew of dogs. And so that's how it unfolded. And it's been super fun to get letters and notes from fire families and grandparents of fire families, and just that say, thanks, you helped me tell my story to my grandkid. Or this, I'll get pictures of kids that are all dressed up like a hotshot, and they put together their backpack just like it says in the book with all the different components. And so if I can have an impression on the next generation of firefighters and those families and those kids, and they smile a little bit, and it's always an awesome thing to read to a kid. So that's the reason. And I'm always going to be trying to stretch myself and stretch my science and stretch my brain in different dimensions that challenge me in different ways. And this was one of those. So
Yeah, it's I didn't know. I mean, I knew you wrote the book, but I didn't know it was kind of like kind of an attempt to bridge that gap because I'm reading this synopsis, and I'm reading the abstract at first, and it's talking about millijoules per day, milligrams of sodium, carbohydrate replacement, the impaired recovery, thermoregulatory response, and then I get to this section that says the occupation also imposes an emotional strain on the firefighter and their families. And it's
yep,
like you forget about that, and you forget how that affects your morale on the line. And it
yep,
was insightful to include it, but it also, I think, pays an ode to the job, their profession. And I just
yeah.
thought that that was cool. But we bought a copy. So my boys are going to get that. And I'm excited to read it to them. I'm sure that they're going to love it. They love dogs. They love outdoors. So I'm sure they'll be into it.
That's awesome. Well, make sure to explain that it's not a hotshot crew; it's a crew of dogs, so it's a hot dog crew.
I'll be sure to tell them they'll get a kick out of that, especially our 4-year-old. He often goes to the grocery in his fire, it's usually structural fire gear, but
Yeah.
I'm sure he's gonna want a yellow like a yellow button up and some green pants and to complete the garb.
Well, I did the original version, and then I felt like it was it's fairly complex. It's for kind of not an older readership, but like an 8-year-old, 10-year-old in that ballpark. And so I did build a young reader's version, which is the same, essentially the same storyline, but in a much easier to read. Like you can sit down and read the story. I've been there many times. It's 9 o'clock at night. You just want them to go to bed, and you're going to read Good Night Moon for the thousandth time.
Oh, it's like you know
This
it,
is
yeah.
or Go Dog Go, or one of those good things. But the Rango and Banjo Young Readers version it's a much simpler, shorter read than the other one. But yeah.
I'm glad to hear that because that's what we bought, and I was a little bit
Oh,
worried
good.
that I was going to be up till 11:30 reading Rango, and because they'd both stay awake and listen to the whole thing if I bought it. So we got the young readers version. Brent, I really truly cannot thank you enough, and you're going to join us again for a second episode where we can talk more about training and the pack test and some, kind of some of those things. But um, if people were interested in finding you, getting a hold of you, anything like that, is there any information you want to leave in terms of how people can contact you?
I think if you link the tagline in my email, that is just my university webpage, that has a lot of resources, as well as my email. You can certainly reach out. I yeah, I'm always will answer those emails. But it provides other resources, from maybe some other podcasts to some videos, to some other things that we have done over the years, not just in fire, but in other. We've done a lot of ultra endurance type studies and things like that. So
That'll be perfect, and I know that one because I've perused and clicked every link, so I'm happy to put that in the show notes for the folks that are interested. And like I said earlier, I'll definitely link this study so if people want to read it, they can, and I look forward to us doing the second episode.
awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Brent, thanks for your time. I really do appreciate it. And if you want to send me over a good shirt size, we'll get some stuff over to you to say thanks. And then I look forward to us linking up here in another couple weeks.
Sounds good.
Thank you guys for listening. Thanks to Dr. Brent Ruby for being patient for me to get this out. We recorded this actually before Christmas, and we did 2 parts of it. You'll hear the next part coming in next week. So he was very gracious in dealing with the back and forth emails and trying to get schedules lined up. And so I'm grateful for that. And hopefully you guys enjoyed part 1. Again, everything mentioned linked in the show notes. If you want to check out the article from Heidi, if you want to check out Dr. Brent Ruby's work, including the study that we mentioned so much in the podcast, you can look at those in the show notes and find everything there that you need. If you are interested in our Foundations Plus program, we will have a new group starting July 2nd. That's the first week of July. That'll run for a period of about 10 to 11 weeks. And if you're interested in that, you can sign up or explore more of the options related to that on the website. And yes, that too is linked in the show notes. We always appreciate you guys joining us. If you've got questions, as always, send those to us at info@v2pnutrition.com, and we would be happy to answer those. We will see you back here again in a couple of weeks for part 2.